Inflationary pressures have been surging across the globe, and in turn, financial markets have been feeling the heat. And if domestic inflation was not enough, Australians also have to face the threat of rising inflation in the US. One of the key economies in the world, the US has an enormous hold on the financial ecosystems of other countries. A jump in inflation in the US signals rising living costs across the world. And for Australians, the implications of this can be seen in multiple areas. The highly interconnected global economy means that small changes in one country quickly travel to another part of the world. And additionally, inflation in America has shot up at never-before-seen rates due to many global adversities taking place at once. For one, the Russia-Ukraine war has created much of the price momentum across countries, and a damaged supply chain ecosystem only adds to the problem. So how do price pressures travel from the US to Australia? Here are a few key points to remember about rising inflation. First of all, there's no denying that the US dollar is a threshold currency for many countries. Fluctuations in the dollar are reflected in the economies throughout the globe. But on the contrary, the Australian dollar does not have that much impact on the US, let alone the entire world. First and foremost are the rises in interest rates, which have resulted from soaring inflation. In March, the US Federal Reserve raised federal funds rate a few weeks before the Reserve Bank of Australia raised its cash rate. Rising US interest rates can impact Australian markets through the borrowing channel. Aussie banks depend on foreign markets to access their funds, and rising interest rates can mean higher borrowing costs for domestic banks. And banks paying higher borrowing fees will ultimately forward these costs to consumers. The bank raised its interest rates soon after the US Federal Reserve announced its first rate hike. And so the RBA is likely to take a path like the US Federal Reserve to protect the bank's interests. And going by this narrative, the Fed's latest rate hike of 50 basis points could mean the central bank will also take a more aggressive route in monetary policy tightening. The fact is enough to ring alarm bells across mortgage holders, which form a large proportion of the Australian population. At the moment, mortgage lending is the highest level ever in Australia, and therefore the Australian economy is highly susceptible to interest rate changes. High inflation often gives birth to vicious cycles of a never-ending rise in prices. And rising prices across the US will quickly spill over to other parts of the world, including Australia. This means that companies in the US facing increased production costs will not just sit idle and do nothing. Instead, they'll try to regain their margins by pushing up the prices of their products. And so imports from the US are likely to become more expensive, and those items which do not have an alternative in the home economy will be imported at high prices. Depending on American raw materials, Australian producers will be forced to raise the prices of goods and the services they offer to domestic consumers. On top of this, supply-side snags have already contributed to higher costs. Other areas that have already shown an impact are the equity and bond markets, for one. Rising US inflation pushed up the US Treasury bond yield, which means that higher borrowing costs for Australian banks. Sharp rises in US bond yields can also hurt equity markets, and interestingly, the Australian share market has shown a negative impact after reports of high inflation in the US came out. The Reserve Bank's massive rate hike of 50 basis points led to a decline in investor sentiment, with all sectors of the share market falling. Although on the brighter side of things, rising inflation could also signal higher wages in Australia. At the moment, experts are nervously eyeing the upcoming wage data, which will shed more light on where the economy is headed. It may also hint at how aggressive Reserve Bank of Australia's upcoming rate hikes may be. More updates to follow. I'm Holly Shields for Kalkine Media.